Greetings, everyone. This is Sister Crystal here with Let's Talk Classic Hip Hop with a hip hop eulogy remembering the late, great Shock G. Shock G, leader of the legendary hip hop group Digital Underground, was laid to rest on May 1st, 2021, according to reports from People.com. Family and friends of the rapper and producer born Gregory Edward Jacobs gathered together to say their final goodbyes at an intimate funeral held at the Allen Temple AME Church in Tampa, Florida. The service was streamed live on the church's website. The service lasted nearly 4 hours as hundreds of people paid their respects. Members of Digital Underground were also in attendance, including friend Ronald Brooks, known as Money B, who was quoted in part as saying, but quote, basically, the arts was everything, and he was just such a giving person. About a week earlier, Money B shared how he received the call that his friend Shock G had passed away. Money B stated to a news outlet, quote, when I answered the phone, I just heard crying, and they were like, he's gone. Immediately, I knew what he was saying, but I didn't want to acknowledge it. He also shared that it had been months since he had spoken with Shock G, and they never discussed any issues his friend may have been facing. Money B said, quote, our conversations were usually about how's your son, and he's telling me what he's doing and the good things and sending me pictures and things like that. Ironically, Money B and Shock G were supposed to connect over the phone the Monday before Shock G passed away. Money B continued, quote, I told myself I should call him, but then I just said I was going to wait for him to call me because it was good news I had to share, he said. Selfishly, I wanted him to call me. He said, looking back, it was a moment he regretted. Celebrity tributes to Shock G include, but are not limited to, Busta Rhymes, Jermaine Dupri, George Clinton, CeeLo Green, Tretch, Chuck D, and Bootsy Collins, who shared the following in a tribute with Rolling Stone magazine shortly after Shock G's passing on April 22nd, 2021. Bootsy Collins and Parliament Funkadelic were a tremendous influence on Shock G, who sampled them religiously and took a nod from them also with his penchant for various costumes and characters. He was such a fan that, as Bootsy Collins recalls in his tribute, when Shock G got the chance, he drove all the way from San Francisco to Bootsy Collins' home in Cincinnati just to vibe and record on my new ADAT machines back in the 1990s. I know that's right. I know that's right. Shock G, aka Humpty Hump, was not playing. He drove nearly 3,000 miles from California over to Ohio. And now, mind you, this was back in the 1990s. And so I wonder if Shock G, aka Humpty Hump, if he took Route 66 to get over to Ohio. And for those, I'm deviating a little bit, but if for those who know Route 66, that's the route where you can go from California all the way across the country, all the way to New York, just taking Route 66. Now, I know back in 1990s, at least the early 1990s, a lot of Route 66 was still intact, but nowadays they broke it up for highways and stuff. And see, that's what you do when you really want, vibe with someone and all that. You do what you gotta do. I wonder that trip must have took like several days or whatever. 'Cause I know he had to stop somewhere. Or if that was a constant trip, like 3 or 4 day trip. Wow. I know that's right. And that's the thing when people pass away, unfortunately, you get to hear these amazing stories and oftentimes unfortunately, you don't really hear these stories until after a person pass away. And someone like Shock G, I can tell he was very private. There are a lot of stars out there that are private, and Shock G is one of them. So I'm glad that he made connections with people like Bootsy Collins that are still around that are willing and able to share their stories, great stories that they had of Shock G. Bootsy Collins continues, "This is when I started to realize he was not just a rapper, he was a musician as well," says. He studied P-Funk music, George Clinton, and my different personalities like Bootzilla, Casper, Dr. Funkenstein, and so many others. He took what we had been doing and made it fresh for that new era. You can really hear the similarity of his and my vocals on Humpty Hump. That is when I realized how cool my voice must have sounded to my GPs and Funketeers. Bootsy Collins continues, "This guy was just as silly as me and just as serious as life that lives in the liver. He had a cartoon mind. He was straight out of Hollywood squares. And if you heard any noise, it was him and his boys, Digital Underground. He wanted you all to have fun while he hosted and toasted the party." And he also ended his note by saying, "Yes, Shock G will be missed because he did shock the world. Prayers going out to his precious family and friends. We love you, little brother." Gregory Edward Jacobs was born on August 25th, 1963, in Brooklyn, New York, or New York City. I'm seeing both. Jacob spent his formative years moving around with his family. He began his musical pursuits early on as a drummer, and this was before he got into hip hop, and this was while hip hop was still underground during the 1970s. He dropped out of high school and formed a DJ crew that performed around town, which led to a job as a part time on air DJ as a teenager. So he was around 15 or 16 years old at this point. Now, it's reported that he was let go from that job because he played a 15-minute long album version of the song Not Just Knee Deep by Funkadelic in a 5-minute time slot. So once he was let go of that gig, he backpacked around the country. And during his explorations, he expanded his musical interest into playing the keyboard and the piano. And he eventually settled down to get his diploma and went to college to study music. In 1987, Jacobs Chopmaster J, real name Jimmy DeWright Jr., formed Digital Underground and dropped the single Underwater Rhymes. 2 years later, they signed to Tommy Boy and had expanded to include DJ Fuse, Money B, and Shoe Movie Smooth. The group's 1990 debut album, Sex Packets, housed their biggest song to date, The Humpty Dance, which reached number 11 on Billboard's Top 200. A classic in its own right, the song, including Jacobs, aka Shock G's, distinctive nasally voice as Humpty Hump, would go on to be sampled by dozens of rappers and producers. Shock G with Digital Underground released This Is an EP release in 1991, and they followed it up with their sophomore album, Sons of the P, later that same year. The album went gold along with its single, Kiss You Back. They released four more albums: 1993's Body Hat Syndrome, 1996's Future Rhythm, 1998's Who Got the Gravy, and 2008's Cause a DU Party Don't Stop. And Shock G released his only solo album, Fear of a Mixed Planet, in 2004. In addition to Digital Underground, Gregory Jacobs, aka Shock G, made television and film appearances, including but not limited to Nothing But Trouble, released in 1991 with Dan Aykroyd. He also toured and performed with George Clinton and P Funk, including a set at Woodstock 99. Okay, so here's where I am going to share my fondest memory of Shock G. So I never got a chance to meet him in person, but I do remember seeing an interview of Shock G. Maybe he was doing an interview like I think it was either the late 1990s or early 2000s. And he was talking about health and eating healthy. And he was talking about how you can take some kale. And I have to give Shock G credit for helping me find a different way to like kale because I really didn't like kale much. But he was saying how you can take raw kale, or he liked to take raw kale and have honey mustard sauce. So eat raw kale with honey mustard sauce. And I'm like, oh, that sounds pretty good. And I actually tried it. And I'm like, you know what? That's pretty good. So I have to give Shock G credit for me trying raw kale with honey mustard sauce because other than that, I would not eat raw kale. Also, in another fond memory, in 1990, when the Humpty Dance video first came out, no one could tell me that Humpty Hump and Shock G weren't two different people. Like, no one could tell me. And mind you, I was a teenager back then. Humpty Hump and Shock G, I just knew that they both were two different people because in the Humpty Dance video, you see Shock G in the video in the background. Like he's one of the background singers in the video. Check out the video. I think it's on YouTube and everything. Classic video. The original song is like 6.5 minutes long or something like that. Feel free to check it out. My favorite, absolute favorite songs by Digital Underground and Shock G. But Shock G and Humpty Hump are together in the same video. So my thought was there's no way that they have to be two different people because they're both in the same video. Mind you, this is back in 1990. Videos and rap videos were still fairly new. So I could not fathom in my mind how was it possible that Humpty Hump and Shock G can both be in the same video at the same time. It wasn't until years later, years with an S, that I found out that Shock G and Humpty Hump were both the same person. So that's my confession. If you guys want to comment, let me know if you guys are old enough to remember. But that was the joy that Shock G brought to people. But he also was serious too. He wasn't just all about happy, happy, joy, joy. He also was very intelligent and serious also, but he also brought fun and everything. So we really appreciate him for that. And he will be forever missed. In closing, Gregory Shock G. Jacobs was laid to rest in an intimate church ceremony on May 1st, 2021, after being found unresponsive in a motel room in Tampa, Florida on April 22nd, 2021. It was reported that there were no signs of trauma and that his father, Mr. Edward Racker, said an autopsy would be performed. He was 57 years old. The results of the autopsy could take several weeks or more. My condolences go out to the family and friends and fans of the late, great Shock G. You are forever missed.